The courtroom was silent except for the soft shuffle of papers and the faint hum of the air conditioning. I sat there, hands clenched in my lap, heart pounding in a rhythm that felt like warning bells. Across from me he sat, the man I once called my husband, the man whose smile had once promised forever. Now, that smile was twisted with venom. "I'll take everything from you," he said, his voice cold, calculated, echoing off the marble walls. Each word cut deeper than any blade could. It wasn't just the legal jargon. It was the culmination of months of deceit, lies, and the slow erosion of the life we had built together. His words weren't a threat. They were a promise. I stared at him, the man who had once whispered in my ear about dreams of children, vacations, and growing old together. It was almost laughable, the stark contrast between that memory and the monster sitting before me now. I could see the hunger in his eyes, not for love, not even for justice, but for domination. He wanted to crush me, to erase my existence in the life we had shared. The divorce proceedings had been a storm from the start. He had meticulously gathered every shred of evidence, twisting facts and memories to make me seem guilty, fragile, undeserving. But what he didn't know was that in his obsession to destroy me, he had overlooked one crucial thing: my resilience. I wasn't the frightened, dependent wife he had married. I had been breaking free quietly, quietly building strength while he flaunted his power and arrogance. The judge's gavel snapped me back to the present. "Is there any further statement?" the judge asked, looking over the rim of her glasses at my ex-husband. He shook his head, a smug, satisfied tilt of his chin. It was as though he already imagined victory, already counted the pieces of my life he believed he would take. I breathed in slowly, keeping my composure. For a fleeting second, I allowed myself to imagine surrendering, to feel the weight of his words crushing me. But then I remembered the nights I spent alone, crying silently into my pillow, the nights I prayed for courage, for clarity. And I remembered something else. He had underestimated me, as he always had. "I have something to say," I said, my voice steady but soft, carrying a weight that seemed to make the air in the courtroom shiver. He turned, eyebrows raised, clearly expecting fear. But he would be disappointed. I didn't tremble. I didn't beg. "You think you can take everything?" I began, my eyes locking onto his with an intensity that startled even me. "But there are things you can't touch, things that belong only to me. My dignity, my strength, my future, and what you're about to see is the beginning of the consequences of underestimating me." A ripple of unease passed over him, subtle but there, like the first hint of a storm cloud over a sunlit sky. He had always been confident, always believed he controlled every piece of my world. But confidence, I realized, was often the first crack in a fortress built on arrogance. The hearing adjourned, but the words lingered in the air, a silent promise of the war that was only just beginning. He had declared his victory before the battle even started, and in that arrogance he had unknowingly planted the seeds of his own downfall. I left the courtroom that day with a calmness he could never understand. Behind the calm was a fire, quiet but unrelenting, a fire that would consume betrayal with precision and sweetness and would turn his nightmare into reality. After the courtroom, the world outside seemed eerily quiet. The winter sun was pale, casting long shadows on the streets, but inside me, a storm was raging. I walked past the cafe where we had once shared laughter over coffee, past the bookstore where he had bought me that first novel I still treasured. Each familiar sight was a reminder of the life that had been stolen from me, not by fate, but by him. I returned to the apartment I had fought so hard to keep, my sanctuary from his manipulations. The walls, painted in soft shades I had chosen, were silent witnesses to my grief and my resolve. I poured myself a cup of tea, hands trembling slightly, and let the warmth seep into my fingers. I needed clarity. Anger alone was not enough. It had to be channeled, precise and deliberate. For weeks, I had studied him. Every phone call, every subtle brag, every casual mention of his so-called triumphs. He was predictable in his arrogance, careless in his celebrations. That was my advantage. While he flaunted wealth and influence, I quietly rebuilt my world, piece by piece, unnoticeable, untouchable. He thought the war was over, that he had won. But he didn't know that victory could be an illusion, and illusions could shatter spectacularly. I opened my laptop and began to write, documenting every instance of betrayal, every lie, every manipulation he had used against me. I created a network of evidence, organized meticulously, anticipating the moment when his confidence would become his weakness. It was a slow burn, a patient strategy, and the longer I waited, the sweeter it would be. That evening, I ran into Emma, my oldest friend. She had been a silent witness to the deterioration of my marriage, the nights I had cried, the moments I had doubted myself. "You're stronger than he'll ever imagine," she said, her eyes unwavering. "Don't let him see you break." I smiled faintly, but inside, her words lit a fire that had been smoldering for months. She didn't know the full plan, of course, but she sensed the shift. She sensed that the hunted was becoming the predator. I spent the night mapping out every step. He had assumed I would fight from a place of weakness, from fear. He had assumed I would crumble, but the truth was far more dangerous. I had been gathering strength in silence. Every meeting with lawyers, every interaction with his associates, every casual remark he had made about controlling my life, everything was now a thread in the web I was weaving. Sleep came in fitful bursts, haunted by memories of betrayal, but tempered by visions of justice, not the cold, impersonal kind, but the sweet, deliberate retribution that only comes when the betrayed becomes the master of her own fate. I realized then that revenge was not a moment, it was a process. A storm that builds quietly, almost unnoticed, until it bursts with devastating clarity. By morning, I knew what I had to do. The divorce would not be a tragedy, it would be the opening act of his nightmare, and I would play my role with precision, emotion, and inevitability. The man, who thought he could take everything from me, was about to discover that some losses cannot be measured by money, property, or status. Some losses cut deeper, leaving scars that no arrogance could heal. As the first light of dawn crept through the curtains, I made a silent vow. He would rue the day he underestimated me. He still didn't see it coming. That was the beauty of it. While he basked in his imagined victory, I moved quietly, deliberately, like a shadow slipping through a house unaware of its intruder. Every smile he gave, every arrogant nod he threw at the world, was a step closer to the downfall he couldn't yet perceive. I started small, nothing overt, nothing that could be traced directly back to me. Subtle disruptions to his carefully curated image. A whispered rumor here, an anonymous tip there. I watched from the sidelines as his world began to crack in ways he hadn't anticipated. Colleagues grew cautious around him. Allies questioned his judgment, and the trust he had taken for granted wavered. He was still blind to the source, still arrogant enough to believe it was just the randomness of life conspiring against him. The first confrontation came unexpectedly. At a gala he had insisted I attend, though I had long ago learned to endure his performances. I moved through the crowd with measured grace. My dress, elegant but understated, drew glances, but it wasn't the attire that mattered. It was the presence. I smiled politely at his friends, nodded at associates, all the while watching him. He was tense, fidgeting, the first cracks of unease already forming at the edges of his carefully crafted mask. "I thought you'd be avoiding these events," he muttered under his breath when I approached. His voice carried the mix of irritation and disbelief he always had when confronted with something he couldn't control. "I've learned that some things are better observed quietly," I replied softly, letting the words hang between us like a trap. He couldn't see the trap yet, couldn't see that every move he made tonight was being quietly redirected, twisted by the threads I had been weaving for weeks. When he turned away, I allowed myself a private smile. The first pieces were in place, and the game had officially begun. Back at home, I found solace in the meticulous planning of my next steps. Every email he sent, every meeting he attended, every financial decision he boasted about became part of my tapestry. I studied his routines, his habits, even his personal weaknesses. The arrogance that had once drawn me to him now became the blueprint of his undoing. It wasn't just revenge, it was artistry. Each move had to be precise, each strike calculated to leave him shaken but unaware of my hand. The thrill of control, the knowledge that he had underestimated me, surged through me. I felt a power I hadn't known I possessed, a dangerous, intoxicating confidence. Late that night, I received an unexpected message. One of his closest associates had noticed anomalies in his accounts, odd patterns that didn't make sense. The seed of doubt had been planted, and it was spreading like wildfire. My pulse quickened not from fear, but from the realization that the first domino had fallen. He was beginning to see that his perfect world was not as flawless as he believed. I allowed myself a moment of reflection, letting the anger and betrayal mix with satisfaction. This was only the beginning. The real devastation would come slowly, inevitably, until he understood fully that trying to take everything from me had been his gravest mistake. And when that moment arrived, when his world finally crumbled, he would know that I had not just survived, but that I had orchestrated his nightmare with patience, precision, and a sweetness only someone deeply wronged could understand. As I lay in bed that night, I closed my eyes and imagined the look on his face when reality finally caught up with him. The storm was coming, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. By the time the weekend arrived, his carefully constructed world was starting to show cracks he could no longer ignore. The emails I had sent anonymously, the subtle leaks of his missteps, and the quiet questioning of his closest allies had all begun to compound. What had once been his fortress of arrogance now trembled under the weight of doubt, and he didn't even know who was shaking its foundations. He came home that Friday evening, triumphant as ever, expecting the usual admiration from neighbors, colleagues, and friends who had once hung on his every word. Instead, he was met with polite nods that carried subtle reservations. He frowned, brushing it off as temporary, though I could see the unease flicker in his eyes. He had no idea that the storm was centered in my calm, deliberate hands. I greeted him with a smile that was warm enough to seem innocent, yet cold enough to hint at the danger he hadn't recognized. "You look tired," I said casually. My tone was light, but the subtext was precise. He was already being affected by the first rounds of my plan. "I'm fine," he replied, masking irritation with bravado. "Just the usual stress." I nodded, understanding exactly how he felt. Stress was coming to him, but unlike the fleeting kind he often experienced, this stress was meticulously engineered. He was beginning to see that his allies wavered, that his decisions were being questioned, and that his influence was no longer absolute. Every whispered doubt, every suspicious glance, every carefully planted rumor was part of the intricate web I had spun. That night, I reviewed the next phase of my plan. I had documented everything: financial inconsistencies, professional misjudgments, even personal betrayals he had overlooked. It was no longer about the courtroom, no longer about winning back what he had tried to take. It was about dismantling the arrogance that had made him believe he could control my life. And I would do it slowly, precisely, savored like a melody that builds tension before the crescendo. The first direct confrontation came 2 nights later. He accused me, in a rare outburst, of meddling in a financial decision at work. His voice was sharp, accusatory, the first crack of desperation showing through, but I didn't react with fear. I simply observed, allowing him to vent while remaining composed. The frustration was evident. He was beginning to sense a force against him that he could not easily identify, and that realization made him uneasy. "You think you can surprise me?" he demanded, trying to mask the doubt creeping into his tone. I tilted my head slightly, keeping my voice calm. "I never need to surprise you. Sometimes consequences arrive quietly, and sometimes they arrive in ways you don't expect." The words seemed to hang in the air longer than usual, and I could see it. His mind, for once, racing, trying to anticipate what I might do next. That was my victory. The man who had vowed to take everything from me was no longer certain of anything. His confidence had eroded, his certainty faltering, and the very foundation of his arrogance was beginning to crumble. By the end of the week, whispers had turned into murmurs, murmurs into questions, and questions into doubt. My plan was working. Every seed I had planted was growing, invisible yet unstoppable. And I knew, with the clarity of someone who had endured betrayal and risen stronger, that his nightmare had only just begun. As I watched him wrestle with a reality he could not control, a quiet satisfaction settled deep within me. This was not just revenge. It was justice, refined and personalized. He had tried to destroy me, but in the end, it was he who was unraveling. And soon, very soon, he would understand that nothing he could take from me would ever compare to the power I had reclaimed, the power to shape my own destiny and to turn betrayal into a triumph.